Welcome to this podcast for Chapter 15, entitled Unique Aspects of Healthcare or Health Economics. This follows the other podcast up from Chapter 14 on basic aspects. So this is a little more advanced, a little more of esoteric topics. There are 11 pages of textbook that you should read, as well as watching this podcast. There will be 19 slides in this podcast, and we will cover 4 IRATs that should show up. So please take some notes on your outline. As we get into this chapter, I would like you to take a look at the textbook and focus in on Table 15.1. which gives examples of utilization measurements for various types of healthcare services. I'd also like you to take a look at Table 15.2, which it lists incentives under various forms of hospital reimbursement. And finally, Figure 15.1, which discusses the relationship between health and medical care, I should say. There are 6 objectives that you can read here. We will be addressing each of those objectives as we go through this podcast. Again, there are 19 slides. It's not particularly long, but very important to listen in. There are 4 basic types of market structure: perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. And we'll be discussing each of these types of market structure in turn. First, with perfect competition. The characteristics of perfect competition include many buyers and sellers, freedom of entry and exit, or relative freedom of entry and exit, standardized products, full and free information, and no collusion. Probably the best example of perfect competition would be like in the commodities market, where you're selling, for example, things like wheat, corn, and so on. There are many buyers and sellers. The number of buyers and sellers has to be large enough so that the entrance or exit of one firm or customer does not affect the market prices. Companies do not set prices, the market does. The companies are price takers. The demand curve is horizontal, perfectly elastic, where if a firm increases its prices, it would lose all of its revenue because consumers would just buy from another firm. Now on this next slide, there'll be an IRAT that comes from this particular slide, so be very careful. Freedom of entry and exit. Most industries have barriers to entry or exit. Barriers include patents, regulation, capital, training, technology, etc. So, for example, pharmacy, you need 6 years of training. So that's a bit of a barrier to entry for most people into the practice of the profession of pharmacy for that service. Exit or fixed assets are not transferable, like you build a manufacturing plant for pharmaceuticals, that can be an exit barrier. In perfect competition, however, you have standardized products. All products have many substitutes. For example, gasoline, tires, and pants. Now, I should have said also, going back to that slide, you need to know about an IRAT for this that comes from this particular slide. You need to know that healthcare services are usually less standardized than the products of most industries. So, for example, when a patient sees you, you tailor your services to that particular patient and that particular needs. So in that way, the healthcare industry differs from most other industries. Okay, moving on. In perfect competition, you have full and free information. Customers have full information regarding products and sellers. Consumers have knowledge to be able to compare products and sellers. There's no collusion in perfect competition. Firms compete against each other rather than get together to set prices. Collusion is more likely if there are fewer sellers so that they can police one another. Again, collusion is against federal law. But attempts are made quite often to collude. Now, another market structure is monopoly. When you have one seller of a product with no close substitutes, you see this, for example, in the with defense industries, the making and selling of armaments. It can maximize revenue by restricting supply and increasing price. There's patents that grant temporary monopolies to encourage innovation. Some monopolies exist because more sellers would actually increase prices because of barriers to entry, like public utilities. There's something also called monopsony, where you have one buyer, the federal government, for the military. Monopolistic competition, similar to perfect competition, except it does not have standardized and interchangeable products. Firms rely on product differentiation, promoting the differences. A good example of monopolistic competition is the auto industry. Now, an oligopoly is few sellers and many buyers. Firms are frequently interdependent, and the dominant firm influences the market through price leadership, price setters, either increases or decreases. An example is breakfast cereal. Now, there will be an IRAT that comes from this particular slide. And you need to know here that monopolistic competition is the market structure characterized by non-price competition. Moving on to the healthcare market. Does healthcare fit the competitive model? In a survey of healthcare economists, half said no. The reasons given were the number of buyers and sellers, entry to and exit from the market are restricted, variations in products, services, and quality, full and free information, inelastic demand, universal demand, unpredictability of illness. Healthcare is a right, supplier-induced demand, and third-party insurance and patient-induced demand. So all of these suggest that healthcare doesn't fit the competitive model. Again, still on the healthcare market, one of the issues is the number of buyers and sellers. There's a maldistribution of supply. Availability of services is inadequate in some areas, especially in rural areas. There's consolidation among sellers and buyers that may reduce competition. And again, entry to and exit from the market. There's high barriers to entry for suppliers, time and cost of education, regulations on institutions, and also resources are not easily transferable. Specialized designs of hospitals and equipment make it difficult to convert to other uses. Continuing on in the healthcare market, there's variations in products, services, and quality. It's difficult to identify substitutes because care is usually customized and individualized. Quality is sometimes difficult to measure. Full and free information requires specialized knowledge. Incomplete information regarding price and quality, and the above makes consumerism difficult in the healthcare market. When you're looking at the healthcare market, you're looking at inelastic demand. At times, services are needed. Consumers may not be price sensitive, acute illness, emergencies, payment by third parties. So when you want your health care, you aren't that concerned about price. Like going to the gas station, you'll pay it because you need it right away. Prices have increased, but so has demand. There's a thing called universal demand. Healthcare is used by all. Demand is insatiable, even increasing demand for goods and services that are of low value. Then on this slide, you're going to have an IRAT as well coming from this slide, so be careful and listen. Unpredictability of illness. Although actuarially it can be determined how many people will need services and why, it is impossible to determine who, what, when, and where. Frequently, consumers are not in a position to negotiate. Also is the issue of healthcare as the right. Some believe that healthcare is a prerequisite to being useful and productive. Therefore, ability or willingness to pay should not be a barrier. The price system should not be a determining factor in healthcare. Now, again, there is an IRAT that comes from this particular slide. When you're talking about the predictability of illness, you need to know that healthcare can be insured because the need for health services can be predicted with some certainty for large groups of people, but not for individuals. Again, it can be predicted with some certainty for large groups of people, but not for individuals. So those actuarial professionals can make those predictions pretty easily with statistical analyses. Also looking at the healthcare market, there's supplier-induced demand. Physicians are in a unique position to control both supply and demand for healthcare goods and services. Reimbursement being dependent on both sets up a potential financial conflict of interest. I guess really it's the ethical code of physicians that kind of keeps that in check. Third-party insurance and patient-induced demand. There's something called moral hazard. By decreasing patients' out-of-pocket expenses with, for example, health insurance, demand and consumption are increased. At some point, the value of the good or services provides no additional benefit overall, but patients have little incentive not to overconsume because they're only paying a fraction of the cost, so they are still receiving sufficient utility. So this concept of moral hazard is very important in the healthcare market. Improving economic performance of healthcare using market forces. Many policymakers believe healthcare is a monopoly and should be regulated as a public utility to control fees and prices. Others recognize that healthcare is unique and advocate for allowing the introduction of market forces to improve cost and quality. Continuing on, there's the idea of making patients more sensitive to cost and quality with the transparency of information and a tiered cost sharing defined contributions for health insurance. Also, looking at market forces, there's the idea of report cards, quality and quantity of service of providers to promote competition among providers, and the designing physician and hospital reimbursement schemes with incentives to reduce costs. Now, looking specifically at creating incentives, we're going to have an IRAT from this particular slide. So listen up. Utilization is based on three factors: population effects, duration of treatment, and intensity of services. Incentives must address all three: population effects with preventative care and education, duration of treatment with prospective payment, and intensity of services with case management. So yes, you have this utilization based on these three factors, but you can address them with these options. Finally, on this slide, capitation is a flat fee per patient to provide care. So you might have a primary care physician who gets $150 a month to take care of a patient. And if he has 200, it would be 200 times that. Is one system that addresses all three. It can be used for hospital and outpatient providers. Now, for the IRAT from this particular slide, you need to know that a patient in the emergency room who receives 3 tests to determine the cause of an acute chest pain is a measure of intensity of services. So when you're looking at intensity of services, a good example is a patient in the emergency room who received 3 tests to determine the cause of acute pain in the chest. And finally, this last slide, which is important, balancing cost and value. There's this need to align incentives to reimburse for value, and value is quality divided by cost, and taking that and multiplying it times quantity. You need to apply pharmacoeconomic principles to goods and services. We'll be talking about this in chapter 19. We'll talk about cost minimization analysis, cost effectiveness analysis, cost benefit analysis, and cost utility analysis. There's this need to allocate resources to maximize marginal outcomes. And with that, this is the end of this podcast. Thank you.